Have you ever walked into a room so expensive the air makes you feel broke? That was Nam Sung-jae's penthouse, floor-to-ceiling glass, marble floors, and a silence so heavy it could choke you. Sung-jae sat in the center of it all in a custom chrome wheelchair, looking like a dark god who had misplaced his lightning bolts. A massive saltwater crocodile tattoo crawled up his neck, and his eyes had filed for emotional bankruptcy 2 years ago. He was a paralyzed Korean Mafia boss who terrified his own shadows. And then, Mayesha Maurice walked in, 15 minutes late, carrying a knockoff tote bag and zero fear. 27. That's exactly how many premium Ivy League-certified medical caregivers Sung-jae had fired, terrified, or simply stared at until they quit and reconsidered their life choices. His right-hand man, Bae, was literally developing an ulcer trying to keep the boss alive. Sung-jae didn't care. He was just waiting to fade away in this glass cage above the city. But Mayesha didn't knock. She strolled in wearing bright teal scrubs, her braids pulled back cleanly, radiating the kind of loud, chaotic audacity you only learn in the trenches of the public healthcare system. She dropped her bag on a $10,000 glass table, took one look at the terrifying mob boss, and sighed. Okay, first of all, it's entirely too dark in here. You look like a vampire going through a messy divorce. Let's get some natural light before we both get rickets. Bae braced for a gunshot. The bodyguards subconsciously reached for their weapons. No one spoke to the boss like this. Sung-jae slowly turned his head, the pristine collar of his crisp white shirt shifting against his neck tattoo. He didn't yell. He didn't order her execution. He just stared with those cold, dead eyes. Mayesha stared right back, popped a mint in her mouth, and said, "Blinking is free, sir. Let's get to work." Mayesha did not wait for permission. That was her first mistake, according to the 3 massive bodyguards in the room. Her second mistake was walking straight to the giant glass windows and pulling the heavy black curtains wide open. Bright morning sunlight hit the floor. Next, she pulled out her phone, connected to the penthouse's expensive sound system, and blasted upbeat R&B music. The heavy silence of the room shattered completely. Bae, the head bodyguard, looked like he was about to pass out. Nobody had opened those curtains in 2 years. Nobody played music. Sung-jae sat in his custom chrome wheelchair, looking like a statue carved out of ice. His dark eyes locked onto Mayesha, daring her to make another move. He was a master of silent terror. Men had begged for their lives just from that stare. Mayesha ignored it. She walked right up behind his chair, grabbed the handles, and pushed him smoothly toward the long marble dining table. "Breakfast time, boss," she announced cheerfully, locking the wheels in place. A personal chef silently placed a bowl of warm soup in front of him and quickly backed away. Sung-jae did not move. He did not blink. He just stared at the bowl, refusing to acknowledge it or her. 5 minutes passed. The soup stopped steaming. Mayesha sighed loudly, picked up the silver spoon, and scooped up the broth. "Look, I know you're busy being dark and mysterious," she said, holding the spoon near his mouth. "But you need to eat. Right now, you're acting like a very large, very scary toddler." The bodyguards froze. The music suddenly felt too loud. Sung-jae finally raised his head. He looked at the spoon, then up at her face. For the first time in 6 months, his voice echoed in the room. It was a low, terrifying gravel that made the air feel cold. "If you touch me again, you will lose that hand." Mayesha did not flinch. She just smiled, leaning in a little closer. "Promise?" Mayesha did not lose her hand. Instead, she spent the next hour treating the most dangerous man in Seoul like a regular, grumpy patient. She grabbed his legs, ignoring his dark glares, and started his physical therapy. As she worked his stiff muscles, she did not stay quiet. She complained loudly about her landlord, her broken water heater, and the ridiculous price of eggs. Sung-jae hated the noise. He was used to absolute silence and total fear. Yet, he did not tell her to leave. He caught himself staring as she gathered her thick braids and tied them up with a bright yellow scrunchie. She was chaotic, loud, and completely unafraid of him. It was incredibly annoying, but it was also the warmest he had felt in years. The strange peace shattered when the private elevator chimed. Bay, the head bodyguard, stepped out looking tense. Right behind him was a man with slicked-back hair wearing a flashy silver suit. The man did not wait to be invited. He walked into the living room, a cruel smile spreading across his face. He looked down at Sung-jae and laughed. "Look at the great king," the man sneered, waving his hand at the chrome wheelchair. "Sitting in his little chair while the city burns. Your time is over, Sung-jae. Hand over the shipping docks, or my men will take them tonight." The bodyguards reached into their jackets. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Sung-jae's eyes turned instantly murderous. But before anyone could pull a weapon, Mayesha stood up. She wiped her hands on her teal scrubs, walked right up to the invading gangster, and frowned. "Excuse me, sir," she said loudly. "I don't know who you are, but that shiny suit is hurting my eyes, and you are raising my patient's blood pressure. Visiting hours are over. Get out." The gangster froze. The bodyguards froze. Even Sung-jae stared at her in pure shock. No one breathed. The man in the silver suit stared at Mayesha like she was an alien. Before he could speak, Bae grabbed his arm and forcefully escorted him back to the elevator. The doors closed, but the danger did not leave with him. Bae quickly pulled Mayesha into the hallway. His face was pale. "Do you have any idea what you just did?" he whispered sharply. "That was Kang. He runs the Northern Syndicate. He kills people for spilling his drink, and you just insulted his suit." The heavy reality of the Mafia finally crashed over Mayesha. She was not in a normal hospital. She was standing in the middle of a deadly gang war. A cold shiver ran down her spine. For the rest of the day, her loud, chaotic energy vanished. She did her job in complete silence, keeping her eyes glued to the floor. She gave Sung-jae his medicine from a safe distance and refused to make small talk. Sung-jae watched her closely. He hated this new, fearful version of her. He wanted the loud girl who complained about her landlord back. The silence in the penthouse was no longer comforting. It felt suffocating. By evening, the sun dipped below the city skyline, casting a dark shadow over the massive glass windows. Mayesha stood near the dining table, quietly pouring a glass of ice water. She did not hear the sharp crack of the sniper rifle. She only heard the deafening crash of thick, bulletproof glass shattering into a million pieces. Before Mayesha could even scream, a heavy force slammed into her side. Sung-jae, the man who supposedly could not move his legs, had thrown his entire upper body out of his wheelchair. He tackled her to the marble floor, covering her completely with his broad chest. The cold, intricate scales of his crocodile neck tattoo pressed tightly against her cheek as a second bullet tore through the room. Sleep was impossible after the sniper bullet shattered the living room window. At 2 a.m, the penthouse was as silent as a tomb. Mayesha lay in her new, heavily guarded room, staring at the ceiling. Then, a loud, heavy crash echoed down the hallway. She jumped out of bed and ran toward the noise, finding the door to Sung-jae's private physical therapy gym wide open. Inside, the terrifying Mafia boss was on the ground. His custom wheelchair was tipped over. Sung-jae's chest heaved as sweat dripped from his face. He gripped the metal parallel walking bars, using all his upper body strength to pull himself up. His arms shook violently. For a second, he lifted his weight, but his paralyzed legs dragged lifelessly behind him. He collapsed back onto the hard floor with a frustrated, angry shout. The great king was completely broken. He glared up at her, his dark eyes wild and furious. He expected her to call for the guards, or worse, to look at him with pity. Instead, Mayesha walked over and sat right down on the floor next to him. She crossed her legs and looked straight ahead. "I am not leaving," she said calmly, ignoring his deadly stare. "And I am not calling for help. But I have a very strong shoulder and we have all night. Try again." Sung-jae clenched his jaw, shocked by her stubborn courage. Slowly, he reached out. He wrapped his heavy, muscular arm around her shoulders, the cool scales of his crocodile tattoo brushing against her neck. With her supporting his weight, he pulled himself up, standing for just a few breathless, intense seconds. An hour later, Sung-jae was finally asleep in his bed. Mayesha stood in his dark bathroom, quietly organizing his daily medical tray. As a trained nurse, checking medicines was an old habit. She picked up the bottle of his expensive spinal cord pills. She read the label, frowned, and read it again under the dim light. Her blood ran completely cold. The pills inside did not match the label, and the dosage was dangerously wrong. Maisha stood in the quiet bathroom, staring at the little white pills in her hand. As a nurse, she knew exactly how expensive nerve healers were supposed to look and smell. She brought one pill to her nose. It had a sharp, chalky scent. She placed it in a drop of water on the marble counter. It dissolved instantly into a thick, cloudy paste. Her stomach twisted into cold knots. These were not spinal recovery drugs. They were heavy, military-grade muscle relaxants. Someone on his own medical team was deliberately keeping him paralyzed. She did not wait for the sun to come up. She marched straight into Seungjae's bedroom. He was still awake, staring blankly at the dark ceiling, his chest still rising from his secret midnight workout. Maisha threw the plastic bottle onto his expensive silk sheets. "Your doctors are poisoning you," she whispered fiercely. "These pills are destroying your muscle mass. They are making sure you never walk again." She expected him to roar in anger or call his bodyguards. Instead, Seungjae slowly turned his head. His cold, dark eyes looked at the scattered pills and then up at her face. He did not look surprised at all. "I know," he said softly. Maisha froze. "You knew? And you just kept taking them?" "It was easier," he muttered, turning his face away. "Fighting the traitors in my own house requires a reason to live. I did not have one. But now that you know this secret, they will kill you too. Pack your cheap bag, Maisha. Flee before the sun rises." He waited for her to panic. He expected her to run away. But Maisha did not move toward her bedroom. Instead, she walked straight to the heavy double doors of his master suite. She reached out and loudly clicked the metal deadbolt, locking them inside. She walked back to his bed, scooped up the poisoned pills, and dumped them directly into the trash can. "I don't quit," she said, crossing her arms. "Welcome to rehab, Mafia boss." The next morning, Maisha cracked the heavy bedroom door open just an inch. She lied directly to Bae's face, telling the head bodyguard that Seungjae had caught a highly contagious viral fever. She ordered the entire staff to stay away and locked the deadbolt again, taking absolute control of the master suite. For the next 3 days, the luxurious penthouse became a prison of pure agony. The withdrawals from the heavy muscle relaxants hit Seungjae like a freight train. The terrifying mafia boss was reduced to a thrashing, violent mess. He roared in pain, throwing his heavy arms blindly, shattering a bedside lamp, and cursing at her to let him die. But Maisha refused to flinch. She wrestled with him, using her entire body weight to pin his broad shoulders to the mattress so he would not hurt himself. She wiped the cold sweat from his forehead with a damp cloth, feeding him tiny sips of water while he shook uncontrollably. Then, on the second night, the burning fever completely melted away his cold, dark mafia armor. He stopped fighting and became incredibly vulnerable. The man who terrified the city reached out with trembling hands and gripped her teal scrubs, clinging to her clothing like a drowning man holding onto a lifeline. He buried his face in her arm, hiding from his own nightmares. Maisha held him tight, softly humming a song until his breathing finally slowed down. By the dawn of the third day, the violent storm passed. The fever broke. Seungjae slowly opened his dark eyes. For the first time in 2 entire years, the thick chemical fog was gone from his brain. His mind was sharp, clear, and awake. The room was perfectly silent. He slowly turned his head to the side and saw Maisha. She was sitting on the floor, utterly exhausted, fast asleep with her head resting on the edge of his mattress. Very quietly, his large, tattooed hand reached out across the silk sheets, his fingers brushing gently against the ends of her neat braids. By the 4th morning, the locked master suite no longer felt like a prison. It felt like a sanctuary. Seungjae was finally out of bed and sitting in his custom wheelchair. He wore a crisp, immaculate white button-down shirt, the collar open just enough to reveal the dark scales of his crocodile neck tattoo. The heavy chemical fog that had clouded his mind for 2 years was completely gone. His eyes were sharp, clear, and entirely focused on the woman in front of him. My Myesha was exhausted from 3 days of fighting his fever. She knelt beside his chair, too tired to stand, and carefully rested her head on his lap over a soft yellow blanket. She closed her eyes, simply breathing in the quiet peace. Sung Jae did not push her away. Instead, his large hand rested gently on her braided hair. His terrifying coldness had vanished, replaced by a quiet, burning intensity. He was dangerously charming now, watching her with a fierce protectiveness that made the air feel thick. For a long moment, the rest of the world did not exist. Then, a loud, urgent knock shattered the silence. "Boss!" Bae's voice called through the heavy door, sounding panicked. "You have to open up." Sung Jae frowned, carefully shifting his weight, and unlocked the deadbolt. Bae stepped inside, his eyes widening in shock as he saw his boss sitting up, alert and dangerous. "Sir, the syndicate leaders called an emergency meeting for tonight," Bae said quickly. "Because you have been locked away for days, rumors are spreading that you are brain dead. If you do not show up to the underground gala tonight, Kang and the others will officially seize your entire empire." Sung Jae's jaw tightened. The warm peace of the morning instantly turned back into freezing ice. He looked down at Myesha, who was now wide awake and staring at him with fearful eyes. "Get dressed," he said, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "You are coming with me." The underground gala was held in a gold-plated ballroom beneath the city, packed with South Korea's most dangerous criminals. When the double doors swung open, the entire room went dead silent. Sung Jae wheeled himself into the center looking like a dark, untouchable god, flanked by armed bodyguards. But the shocked stares were not just for him. All eyes immediately locked onto Myesha. She was no longer wearing her teal scrubs. Bae had provided a breathtaking, floor-length black silk gown that hugged her perfectly, making her look just as powerful as the men in the room. The rival underbosses glared with absolute fury, insulted that the king would bring a simple caregiver to a syndicate table. Sung Jae ignored them. He refused to let her leave his side, positioning his wheelchair slightly in front of her like a shield. As they settled at the grand mahogany table, a tall, older man with a fake smile walked over. Myesha felt a cold chill run down her spine. This was Chairman Lee. He's the exact man who had secretly paid the doctors to poison Sung Jae, and the one who orchestrated his accident 2 years ago. "It is wonderful to see you awake, nephew," Chairman Lee purred, leaning heavily on the table. But his cold eyes slid past Sung Jae and locked onto Myesha like a predator watching a rabbit. "And who is this beautiful little pet? You must be careful, my dear. This world is very dangerous, and fragile things break so easily here." He reached out, his fingers invading her space to touch her bare shoulder. He never got the chance. In one lightning-fast, brutal blur of motion, Sung Jae grabbed a silver steak knife from his plate and slammed it downward. The blade pierced straight through the back of Chairman Lee's hand, pinning his flesh deep into the thick mahogany wood. The old man screamed in pure agony, but Sung Jae did not even blink. He kept his grip firmly on the knife, staring directly into the bleeding traitor's eyes with a terrifying calm. Did this fool really think the king was dead? The ride back to the penthouse was a blur of flashing city lights and heavy adrenaline. Sung Jae stared out the tinted window of the armored car, his jaw clenched so tight it looked like carved stone. By attacking Chairman Lee at the gala, he had proven the king was awake. However, he had also made a terrifying mistake. He had shown every ruthless criminal in the underworld that Myesha Maurice was his ultimate weakness. As soon as the private elevator doors opened into the penthouse, Sung Jae started barking sharp orders. He instantly doubled the armed guards at every entrance and locked down the entire building. Then he turned to Myesha, his dark eyes fierce and his voice leaving absolutely no room for argument. "You are moving into my bedroom. I will not let you out of my sight." Being trapped in the same room drove them both completely crazy. The luxurious master suite suddenly felt suffocatingly small. Every single time she walked past his wheelchair, The air between them crackled with a dangerous, unspoken electric tension. She could feel his intense gaze tracking her every move, silently guarding her. The heavy, quiet tension was suddenly shattered by the sharp ringing of Maisha's cell phone. She answered it hesitantly, and within seconds, all the warm color drained from her face. She dropped the phone onto the cold marble floor, her hands shaking uncontrollably. The fire department had called. Her tiny apartment across town, the only safe haven she had ever known, had just been purposely burned completely to the ground. Every memory and everything she owned was turned to ash. A broken, terrified sob escaped her lips before she could stop it. In a heartbeat, Seung-jae wheeled himself forward and pulled her tightly into his strong arms. He held her fiercely against his broad chest, burying his face deep into the crook of her neck. "Let them try to take you," he whispered, his voice vibrating with a dark, terrifying rage. "I will burn this entire city to ashes to keep you safe." The promise to burn the city down was still hanging in the air when the entire penthouse suddenly plunged into pitch-black darkness. The syndicate had finally made their deadly move. The heavy hum of the central air conditioning stopped, leaving a terrifying, dead silence. A second later, the deafening roar of automatic gunfire erupted from the outer hallways. Bae and the newly hired bodyguards were already engaged in a brutal fight just outside the heavy double doors. Inside the master suite, the faint, distant glow of the city skyline was the only light left. Seung-jae gripped the wheels of his chrome chair, his jaw clenched tight in the dark. He quickly ordered Maisha to hide behind the massive marble kitchen island. She crouched low against the cold stone, trembling from the shock of losing her home and the sudden, violent attack. She squeezed her eyes shut, listening to the terrifying sounds of war echoing through the expensive walls. They were completely trapped. Suddenly, a deafening explosion shook the floorboards. The supposedly unbreakable floor-to-ceiling glass window completely shattered inward, raining thousands of sharp shards across the expensive rugs. The freezing night wind howled into the room. A dark, heavily armed figure stepped through the broken metal frame, crunching softly over the glass. The assassin wore glowing green night vision goggles. His head snapped toward the kitchen area, instantly spotting Maisha hiding behind the marble counter. Slowly and deliberately, the killer raised a heavy, suppressed pistol, aiming the red laser sight directly at the center of her back. Seung-jae was too far away to grab the man, and rolling his wheelchair over the thick carpet of broken glass would be entirely too slow. The king had absolutely no weapons, but he refused to watch the only woman he cared about die in front of him. A sound of pure, terrifying rage ripped from Seung-jae's chest. He gripped the metal armrests of his chair so hard his knuckles turned white. Ignoring the burning agony in his spine, he planted his bare feet firmly onto the cold floor, and he stood up. Seung-jae lunged forward on trembling legs, using every ounce of his returning strength to grab the assassin's wrist before the man could pull the trigger. With a brutal twist, he ripped the heavy pistol from the killer's grip and fired a single shot. The assassin crumpled to the glass-covered floor. The exact moment the threat was gone, Seung-jae's exhausted muscles gave out, and he collapsed heavily against the marble island. Seconds later, Bae and a team of loyal bodyguards stormed through the shattered doors, securing the ruined penthouse. They were finally safe. In the quiet, adrenaline-fueled aftermath, Maisha knelt beside Seung-jae on the bathroom tiles, her hands shaking violently as she cleaned a bloody bullet graze on his broad shoulder. The air between them was incredibly thick. Seung-jae looked down at her, his dark eyes burning with raw, desperate emotion. Suddenly, the emotional dam broke. He reached up, tangling his strong hand into her neat braids, and pulled her down into an intense, breathless kiss. It was a desperate clash of survival and undeniable chemistry, filled with all the hidden words they were too afraid to say. But the protective bubble shattered the very next morning when Bae brought in the salvaged mail. Maisha ripped open a thick white envelope, her heart stopping dead in her chest. It was an official acceptance letter to her absolute dream nursing program in London, a fully funded with a massive scholarship. This was the escape she had worked for her entire life. As she stared at the paper with wide, tear-filled eyes, Sung-jae wheeled quietly into the kitchen. His eyes darted to the bold London crest printed on the letterhead. In a single heartbeat, the passionate man from the night before vanished. His sharp jaw tightened, and his handsome face hardened back into the cold, terrifyingly emotionless mafia boss from her very first day. Would the king let his savior escape, or would he destroy her lifelong dreams just to keep her? The passionate warmth in the kitchen vanished instantly, replaced by a freezing silence. Sung-jae stared at the London scholarship letter, and in a single heartbeat, he rebuilt every single dark wall he had torn down. He slowly backed away from Maisha, his dark eyes turning completely blank. "Congratulations, Miss Maurice," he said, his voice as sharp as broken glass. "Your contract here is officially finished. You are just an employee, and it is time for you to leave." Maisha felt like she had been slapped across the face. The man who had kissed her like he was starving just minutes ago was now looking at her like she was a total stranger. Furious and completely heartbroken, she grabbed her letter and marched into her bedroom, slamming the heavy door behind her. She collapsed onto the bed, hot tears streaming down her face. But before she could even process the painful rejection, a strange, cheap cell phone sitting on her nightstand suddenly buzzed. She picked it up with shaking hands. A scrambled, robotic voice delivered a terrifying message from Chairman Lee's syndicate. "We have rigged the floor beneath you with explosives," the voice hissed. "If you stay, we will blow the penthouse to the ground tonight. But if you get on that plane to London, the king lives. The choice is yours." The phone immediately went dead. The blood drained from Maisha's face. She understood exactly what Sung-jae was doing. He was pushing her away to protect her, but staying would actually get him killed. She had to break her own heart to save his life. Moving like a ghost, she quickly packed her few belongings into her knockoff tote bag. She walked out into the silent living room. Sung-jae was sitting in his wheelchair by the shattered window, staring out at the dark city, refusing to even turn around. Maisha paused, her chest aching terribly as she looked at his broad shoulders one last time. She stepped into the private elevator without saying a single word, the metal doors sliding shut on the only man she had ever loved. Would the assassins actually keep their promise, or was she just leaving him to die alone? The heavy silence in the penthouse was suffocating. Sung-jae sat alone in his chrome wheelchair, staring out the shattered glass window at the glowing city skyline. Without Maisha's chaotic warmth, the massive room felt like a cold, empty tomb. He had completely broken his own heart to keep her safe, pushing her away so she could live her dream in London. Now, with his loyal guards spread entirely too thin fighting across the lower floors, he simply waited for Chairman Lee's assassins to arrive and finish the job. He did not care anymore. He gripped the metal armrests, closing his dark eyes as he accepted his deadly fate. Minutes crawled by like hours. Then, the sharp chime of the private elevator echoed through the dark living room. The heavy metal doors began to slide open. Sung-jae took a deep breath, bracing his body for the deafening sound of gunfire. But the gunfire never came. Instead, he heard the sharp, scraping sound of heavy metal dragging against the marble floor. He slowly opened his eyes, and his heart completely stopped in his chest. Standing inside the elevator was not a squad of assassins. It was Maisha. She was still wearing her cheap clothes, fiercely gripping a heavy aluminum baseball bat in her hands. But she was not alone. Pouring out of the elevator and filling the entire hallway behind her were 50 of Sung-jae's most dangerous, heavily armed street-level enforcers. The loyal men had been waiting for a strong leader, and somehow the broke caregiver from the public hospital had rallied the king's entire underground army. Sung-jae was utterly stunned, unable to form a single word as he stared at the woman he thought he had lost forever. Maisha marched right into the center of the ruined living room, staring down the most terrifying mafia boss in Seoul. She tossed the heavy baseball bat onto the floor with a loud clang, crossed her arms, and yelled, "Did you really think I was going to let some cheap suit-wearing gangsters run me out of my own city?" But how on earth had she convinced his most ruthless killers to follow her into war? The moment Maisha dropped the bat, the ruined penthouse exploded into absolute chaos. The 50 loyal enforcers flooded past her, and clashing violently with Chairman Lee's hidden assassins who had finally broken through the dark stairwell. The sudden distraction was exactly what Sung Jae needed. He was no longer a helpless king waiting to die in the shadows. With heavy gunfire echoing around them, Bae and the rest of the elite penthouse security pushed through the broken double doors, joining the massive fight. Within a few brutal minutes, the deadly war completely shifted. The loyalists easily wiped out the invading traitors, disarming them one by one. Chairman Lee was suddenly entirely surrounded in the center of the living room. His expensive suit was torn, and his terrifying confidence was gone. He backed up against the shattered glass window, looking at the small army of men aiming their weapons directly at him. He finally realized his grand plan to steal the Mafia empire had completely failed. He looked at Sung Jae, who was glaring at him with pure murder in his dark eyes, and then the old man locked his cold, desperate gaze on Maisha. Chairman Lee knew he was going to die tonight, but he severely refused to lose without breaking the king's heart first. With a wicked, twisted scream, the mastermind underboss pulled a hidden silver pistol from his ankle holster. He did not aim at the powerful Mafia boss. Instead, he lunged straight toward Maisha, pointing the barrel directly at her chest. Everything seemed to move in terrifying slow motion. Maisha froze, entirely too shocked to run away. Sung Jae roared, violently launching his large, muscular body out of his chrome wheelchair with a terrifying burst of pure, desperate strength. A single, deafening gunshot loudly rang out through the destroyed penthouse. For one terrible, agonizing second, the entire world went completely silent. Then, a heavy body dropped hard onto the broken marble floor, slowly pooling with dark red blood. But who had actually taken the fatal bullet? The smoke finally cleared in the shattered penthouse. It was not Maisha who fell. Chairman Lee lay motionless on the broken marble floor, his silver pistol slipping from his lifeless fingers. Standing tall over him, his chest heaving but his tattooed hand perfectly steady holding the smoking gun, was Nam Sung Jae. The king had protected his queen. Fast forward 6 months later. The cold, dark penthouse was completely unrecognizable. The heavy black curtains were gone forever. You were replaced by floor-to-ceiling glass that bathed the entire living room in warm, golden sunlight. Loud, upbeat R&B music blasted from the expensive speakers, filling the massive space with chaotic joy. The terrifying underworld syndicate had been completely reformed, legally transformed into a massive, legitimate shipping and real estate business empire. And the great king himself no longer sat in a chrome wheelchair. Sung Jae stood proudly by the new windows, dressed in a sharp gray suit, walking slowly and leaning casually against an expensive silver cane. His spine was still healing, but he was finally free. The private elevator chimed softly. Maisha stepped out into the sunlight, but she was not carrying her broken tote bag or wearing cheap teal scrubs. She wore a pristine white doctor's coat over a beautiful dress. She had never boarded that plane to London. Instead, the man who owned the city had secretly bought her an entire state-of-the-art medical clinic right there in the heart of Seoul, fully funding her absolute dream so she would never have to leave his side. Sung Jae turned around as she walked toward him. He let go of his silver cane, reaching out to pull her firmly against his broad chest. The dark scales of his crocodile tattoo brushed softly against her jawline as she looked up at him, feeling perfectly safe. For the first time in his entire life, the terrifying Mafia boss finally, truly smiled. "You are late, Dr. Maurice," he whispered warmly, his dark eyes shining with pure love. Maisha wrapped her arms around his neck and flashed a brilliant, chaotic grin. "Annoying people live longer. Google it." Sometimes, the walls we build to protect ourselves become the very prisons that keep us paralyzed. True healing doesn't happen in perfect silence. It takes a little bit of chaos, a whole lot of stubbornness, and an unexpected kind of love to break those walls down. Never be afraid to let the light in, even if it disrupts your darkness. If Maisha and Sung Jae's journey touched your heart, Make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with someone who needs a reminder that broken things can always be beautifully rebuilt. What was your favorite twist in the story? Drop a comment below and let me know. Thanks for watching.